Okay, hey guys, welcome back to Conversations with Therapists. I'm super excited to be on this episode today. We'll get into that in a minute, but I'm Alyssa. I'm your host, and then with Jennifer, who's also my co-business partner at TME Brand Marketing. And we kind of started this podcast as just, or I guess video podcast. I don't really know what to actually call it. As a way to introduce therapists, coaches, mental health professionals to you guys, to the world. So on that note, let me introduce our next guest, Kimberly Mathis. Oh, I'm so excited, and I'm also a little nervous. Kimberly, you're like a podcasting celebrity.
No.
Kimberly is a former therapist turned coach. She's also a spicy neurodivergent, which right before we started this, we were all talking about our fidget toys. So I definitely want to talk about that. And a firecracker with a rebellious streak. So she helps ambitious women stop being indecisive. So like all women, stop being indecisive and reclaim valuable time spent second guessing themselves. And I think I relate to that on every single level. So I definitely want to talk about that. So but we'll back up. How did you get into therapy?
I actually swore that I was never going to go into anything like mental health because my dad was a psychologist. So I grew up with my dad, like coming home during graduate school and like making me go through these tests,
Yeah, so
he was practicing them. And I just always was like, I'm not going to be like my dad. I'm not going to do anything like that. So I went into college and I was going to be a communications major. That's what I was for like one semester. And then I was required to take a Psych 101. It's like just part of the general curriculum. And I loved it. And I was like, well, son of a bitch. Like, I guess I have to change my major. So I ended up
out like as a freshman.
True.
I wanted to switch to like I was a junior and then it was too late.
True. Yeah. So I just went into it. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do exactly, but I think I knew I always wanted to do some sort of private practice, like working in person with people. And I started out in a graduate program for a clinical psychology PhD. And it was so research heavy. And we weren't going to be doing like anything with clients in person that I was like, oh, I can't do this. So I dropped out of that and applied for the master's in counseling. And I got my master's in marriage and family therapy. And then was a stay-at-home mom for 6 years. So it's been a ride.
It's been a journey. Okay, So you graduated. Were you pregnant when you graduated, or was that like?
I do not know how I did it, but I graduated with a 21-month-old and a 5-week-old.
Oh my gosh.
I probably would not recommend.
No.
I really don't know how I did it now. And my husband at the time was in medical school, so he was like non-existent.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And we were going to move. We were a military family, so we were going to move in like a year and a half. And so I just opted to be a stay-at-home mom for a while, because if you're going to do anything with a master's in counseling, like if you want to see clients and be a therapist, you're going to have to get licensed. And currently, every state is different. So I didn't know where we were going to be. Like, it was just impossible to get licensed and do all the hours and everything. So I was a stay-at-home mom for 6 years until we got divorced and I had to get a job. And for a very short amount of time, I worked in like a community mental health agency. I knew on day one that I was going to need another job. So I lasted about 3 months and then went into private practice.
Oh wow, your switch was fast. Like normally you kind of hear about people who
hardcore.
Yeah, I did do like in between for maybe a year. I worked at like a group practice, but I was like in practice, like seeing one-on-one clients. And I found out about some like unethical stuff going on at that group practice and like some insurance scamming. So I was like, I have to leave. Couldn't find another job. So I was like, well, I guess I'll just start my own practice. And that's what I did.
And your kids were what, like 7?
At the time, let me do math. I think it was about 2016 when I started my own practice. So my older one was 8. Yeah. And younger one was 7.
And you guys, were you ever stationed abroad? Because I
Japan.
know when we met, your ex-husband was stationed abroad.
Yeah, he went to Europe later, during COVID.
Okay.
And before that, we did 2 years in Japan.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Again, while you were stay-at-home momming and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of
That's
pressure.
kind of that's a cool, like,
Yeah, I
culture
loved
and
it.
stuff, yeah.
Loved Japan. I would go back in a heartbeat.
Okay, so how long did you do the private practice life?
So I would say I've been in private practice, whether it's as a therapist or a coach, since 2016.
Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
then when were you like, this is too, I don't know, what was your decision to be
Yeah, to leave.
not a therapist? Yeah, to leave.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I talk about it in detail. It's funny you're asking about this because I just did some podcast episodes. I did like a series on therapy and coaching and why I left and some of the criticisms of the coaching industry. But I think I was always a coachy therapist. Let me say that. I think I was always a coachy therapist. I had worked with a coach in Japan. One of my friends went through a coaching training. It was my first experience working with a coach. And she basically let me pay her like $20 a session because she had just gone through her training and I was going through a divorce. And so she was like my support
In
person.
Japan? All of
Hmm.
this is happening in Japan? Oh my gosh. You have the most
Yeah,
interesting life.
the divorce was happening in Japan. So we were supposed to be there 3 years and we got divorced after 2. And I came back with the kids and he
Yeah.
stayed one more
Oh
year.
my gosh.
Yeah. So my experience with coaching, I loved it. I had been, to therapist on and off since I was a teenager because, like, my dad was in mental health. Like, if something comes up, you go to a therapist. And it had been helpful, but the work I did coaching, I don't think therapy had ever felt quite so um, transformative. Like, it really moved me. The coaching moved me forward in ways that I
Hmm.
didn't feel like therapy did. So I was always kind of drawn to it. I always knew I wanted to do a coaching training and maybe go into coaching at some point. And I went through, I think I signed up for a coaching training in 2019, and it was like a 9-month long training. So I did that. And I think what kind of prompted it, my move, was that I heard a podcast episode with another therapist who had gone into coaching and some of her reasons for doing it. And they had a lot to do with the fact that therapy is a medical model. So a lot of people don't know, like, even if you don't have a diagnosis, if you're using insurance, there's a diagnosis in your file. There's
Right.
no way to use insurance without having a diagnosis. So it's there forever. Your therapist is writing like treatment records. It's referred
Yeah.
to as like, what is the treatment plan? So it's very medical. And I don't think that always is the best fit for just people who are human and going through some things. Like, I don't like the pathology of it.
Hmm.
And then there's also like a lot of history behind the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what clinicians use to diagnose things. There's a lot of history there about what gets decided to be included. Not that long ago, being gay was a mental health disorder.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
and
It was?
I, yeah, oh yeah, not that long ago. Yeah, I think
That's
it was maybe the third version. It was sometime in the late 70s, I think, that it was taken out. I know.
wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's still been some stuff included in there that has been taken out. I think they're on there's like the 5th edition now. But traditionally also, like, a lot of the diagnostic criteria, a lot of research that has been done on these things are not necessarily taking into account minority populations, socioeconomic, groups of people. They have excluded women. So there's just a lot of issues with it.
Yeah.
And I had
For
already been kind of thinking about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Were you on social media with your private practice? Because I know when we met you and you were doing your coaching, you had already begun to develop a very strong
Yes.
voice about these topics that a lot of people that we work with have not developed. Was that something you started when you were in private practice, or did you find kind of freedom in like what you were saying?
Jennifer, can you repeat that last one? We lost you for a little bit. Can you repeat what you said?
If you had started developing your voice for social media during your private practice or when you were transitioning for coaching, because when we met,
I think I did.
You had a very strong
I think I did start
voice
it like
for
while
the
I
kind
was
of
a
topics that you
therapist,
wanted to
but
talk about, and it
there's
sounded
still
confident and dynamite and
keep with
things
you.
that most therapists they can't do. They're very uneven and very unsure of themselves, but you came at it with a lot of courage, where most people are thinking about their patients and people are thinking about their high school friends and how they're going to be viewed. And you just kind of set yourself apart, at least to me, in what you were doing.
I think though, like I was already moving into coaching at that point with what you're talking about. And I won't say it was completely different when I was doing social media and like had my website for therapy, but there is like an expected and even in some ways regulated by your license this kind of like rule about being more of a blank slate. Like you're not supposed to share a lot of personal stuff and you're not supposed to have like political leanings, and it's supposed to be just about like you're just kind of the conduit, you're the facilitator, people don't know much about you personally, and you just talk about your work. So I think I was already like where I was living at the time was, I kind of sometimes joke about it feeling like the buckle of the Bible Belt. Like I was one of the few therapists in my area that was not religious and didn't have a religiously based practice. And I kind of talked about like feminist issues and issues for women on my website. So it was very clear, I think, that I was different from a lot of the other therapists if those other therapists weren't a good fit for you. So I was already kind of playing around with like how to talk about some of these things, but there were still limitations, I think, with being a therapist.
So we talked a little bit before we started about, did you make like a concrete switch at some point, or was it just kind of like
I did.
Like I'm gonna try do both, and then this one kind of fell off? Okay, so you made
I made the switch. I really used 2020 when everything kind of went virtual in March of 2020 for COVID. I had finished my training and my thought was like, well, if ever there was a time to move into coaching with everything going online, now might be the time to do it. So during the rest of 2020, I finished working with my therapy clients. I started advertising and marketing for coaching and taking on coaching clients. And my plan, which I followed through on, was to not have any more therapy clients when I began in January of 21, when I began that year. So that is what I did. And I resigned my license, my therapy license. I had it you have to renew it every 2 years. So before it came up for renewal, I resigned my license in like, I think April of 21. And one of the reasons for that also, and I talk about this on my podcast episode, is I think it was also in 2019, I was the only person, my supervisor for licensure, I'd just been licensed at the end of 2018. My supervisor has like a 2-digit number on her license. She got licensed so early for marriage and family therapy in the state of Tennessee. She's been doing it a long time. I was the only person she knew of to ever have a complaint filed against them with the licensing board. And I had to get a lawyer with my malpractice insurance. They got a lawyer to represent me, to defend me. And it was all dropped. It was a case of a former client I hadn't worked with in like a year, probably in one of the most abusive relationships I'd ever come into contact with patients or clients. And she was finally getting a divorce. and her soon-to-be ex was basically harassing people.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah. So he made up some complaint, and yeah, I had to turn over all my records. I had to be investigated. I had to have an investigator showed up at my office. I had to turn over all communication with her, like even messages that she had sent me in her client portal that were not actually like part of her treatment plan. All of it had to be turned over, and I had to have my lawyer sit there with me while I was basically interviewed and asked about it, and I had to wait for a decision. I could have been fined. I could have had my license taken away, you know.
But I guess that doesn't fall under that like client privilege. Like, how are they allowed to ask you all of that stuff?
Because it's a health record. So legally, they are the health licensing board. They can request all of the records. The only thing that a therapist cannot legally, they don't have to turn over is handwritten notes. Their own handwritten notes that are not included as part of the client file.
That's crazy.
So you think about like, this was also one of my reasons for leaving. Well, that was like the nail in the coffin for me, that experience, you know,
I can see
that someone could use what is there to protect people, right? They would use that in order to like punish me, intimidate me, scare me, and potentially ruin my career. That was just like, I need out of this. And the other thing that I thought about was like clients who might be working with a therapist and they live in an area that's maybe really religious, and, you know, they have relationships or lifestyles, things going on in their life that might be taboo. All of that gets turned over, and who knows who's reading that and seeing it. Whoever's working at the licensing board, you know.
Yeah. I mean, then they can just like come up with a complaint, or, you know, all these there are crazy people out there who will come up with these complaints exactly like what happened. That's I had no idea that like no idea that this was
it wasn't like a totally made up complaint. What it was there had been like an article I shared with her based on our discussions that was like titled something like, you know, 5 things women do to support themselves after a divorce. And his complaint, which met enough requirements under regulations for them to investigate, was that I was telling her what to do. I was telling her to get a divorce.
To me, that like, maybe, I mean, I didn't read that. Obviously, I haven't read that, whatever you put out there. But like, to me, that just like further tries to silence women in these like abusive relationships, because like they maybe don't know how to get out, or they've never ever learned that, or maybe they grew up with an abusive relationship as their model. So
but you're not supposed to tell them what to do. And I guess that was close enough on the line. The fact like that I sent that to her was borderline, like, I don't know, suggesting. It's just ridiculous to me, honestly.
Yeah, that's and that's sad and stressful. And
and I do think that the tide is turning with therapy. Like, more and more therapists are talking more openly about, like, they're being people online and they're talking about issues. But I see that happening at an individual level. I don't see any of that happening like
the national
at the
board
professional level.
Yeah.
It'll be a while.
Yeah. Hopefully, you know, hopefully that's more and more normal, I guess. We'll see. Okay, so that moved you out of the mental health therapy, mental health world, and into, would you call it mental health coaching? Because, you know, there's coaches that do like lifestyle coaching, I guess, and like food coaching and business coaching. But so what are you called?
I have so many thoughts about this. First thing I want to say is that I think the word coaching is used a lot to describe several things and not just coaching. Coaching to me, like at its core, is someone asking you really, really good questions that help you to gain clarity and insight and like gain different perspectives, figure out what you really think about something, like the thoughts that are holding you back, the decision you want to make. So it's really, really good questions. That's the core of what coaching is. And then I think there are people who are saying they're coaching and they're really like consulting, or they're teaching, or they're mentoring, right? Like a business coach who is just like selling strategy, like, here, follow this thing.
Right.
And here's how you learn how to sell. And maybe sometimes that does include some coaching, but I think it's just kind of used very broadly.
Yeah.
And
I think
so
there's
I
a lot
do
of like
coaching.
negative stigma because of how
Yes.
broad you can
Yes.
go.
So I like telling people about that just so it's kind of like planted. So they're kind of watching for this. Like, and that's fine. You can hire anybody you want to, but just know that sometimes what someone is calling coaching isn't necessarily coaching. And then you said, what was the other part of your question? I forget what it was. It was asking about my transition. Oh, mental health. Okay. The way that I think about it, like the biggest differing factor between therapy and coaching is that therapy is a medical model. If you are a therapist, you are technically treating someone under a medical model. You have a treatment plan. There are medical records. It is HIPAA, has to be HIPAA compliant.
Right.
You know, you are talking about the like interventions you are using in order to relieve symptoms, that sort
like
of thing.
therapeutic practices.
Yeah. Even if that's not what's happening in session.
Yeah.
If someone is a therapist, like that's just the structure of it. That is how ultimately that's what it comes down to.
How they're taught, and then it's how they go into their like clinical supervision, and that's further taught into them. And then if they do any kind of specializing, like with, you know, those therapeutic practices, then it's again even more medical.
And there are a lot of therapeutic practices that are useful and beneficial for people who do not have a clinical diagnosis and don't meet criteria for a clinical diagnosis. So I think anytime someone is doing coaching, like they have to be really clear for themselves on like this, I'm not doing a medical structure. I'm not like operating under a medical model. And it's really important to be able to tell when someone might be exhibiting some like clinical symptoms, you know, or there are things that are affecting their ability to function every day and be able to refer out. Yeah. And someone can work with a therapist and a coach at the same time.
I was just about to ask you that. Like, do you ever say like, do you ever have somebody that comes to you and you're like, okay, I think you could benefit from both? And then like,
it has been a while, honestly.
Yeah.
Since I had that. And I would say like, that's why I think I was kind of a coachy therapist. Like, because I was in private practice, I could choose who I wanted to work with. And I just did not work with clients that were really having serious mental health issues. That was never my like audience. That was never my ideal client base. It was people who are functioning well and just like going through some shit and need to figure some things out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's like a lot of people who maybe don't need that medical diagnosis, but they need the decision-making help. Cause I think, so I'm trying to remember back to when I first started working with you, which was 2021, I think.
Oh my gosh.
So Kimberly was one of our former clients and now has just like branched out on her own. I mean, you've been on your own, but you don't need us. You were like, I got this. Like, I think you crushed it. I mean,
thank you.
You just knew exactly what you needed and all of that, and that, you know, you were implementing your own advice, I think. But when we were working with you, you were still doing, I think, both men and women. And the decision making was definitely still like the foundation, but it was not as well, I guess because
prominent.
You chose to go with, you chose to go with women, you know, you kind of took out like this broader decision making, because women, whether it's society, whether it's whatever it is, like they second guess, like that's so second place. Like I know that even when I send work emails, I'm like, I gotta send it to someone else and get somebody else to like is that okay? Or like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is that mean? Like,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
I think you packed
I still
like
do
before then.
work with men. I will have some men. I won't like necessarily turn them away. I have some men, who like follow my social media and are just like, I just want to work with you. And that's fine. I just typically am talking through a lens that is more like women's empowerment and like a feminist lens, like an intersectional kind of feminist lens. So I tend to just have more women working with me. But the decision making, it is like big decisions. Like I have a process that I teach clients for making decisions, like when they're trying to decide between choice A and choice B, like what do I do here? But really the decision making for me, it came about because of my own coaching. And I kind of made the decision. I was really tired of thinking of myself as an outsider and like I just don't belong and I have trouble with friends. And I got coached on it. And it was just like, I just decided I wasn't gonna be influenced by that anymore.
Yeah.
And it made a huge difference for me. And I think my like aha moment when thinking about my own clients and my own work was that decisions don't just have to be these like big choices.
Right.
Like if we decide something, there's an ownership there and there's like there's an element of like taking action, not just kind of like hoping things are different, but like here's my plan, here's what I'm going to do to change this. And so I think about decisions like on every scale. Like it could be I'm making a decision that I want to start talking more nicely to myself, that I'm making a decision to like be more compassionate or to feel more connected to my partner or my children. And so when we look at everything through that lens, then I feel like it goes from that would be really nice to, okay, I'm going to figure out a way for me to implement this.
Yeah. And I think again, when we were working together, for me, because I grew up like with the mental health kind of, my mom is in the mental health world, my sister is, it was like, okay, so how are you different? I mean, you're calling yourself a coach, but how are you different? And one thing you said is, I don't remember exactly what you said, but it was like therapists can suggest, but then like a coach can like give you the
I have the
action.
perfect answer for this.
Yeah.
Because I was asked so many times, like, what's the difference between therapy and coaching? And I really have to say, I think it's like the best answer out there for this because
it stuck with me.
it's like
to
simple
some
and it's
level.
clear. But I think there's always going to be overlap, right? They're not like two completely separate industries.
Right.
But I think about it in terms of like, what are the questions we're trying to answer? And the questions are just different. So like in therapy, most of the time, the main question that is going to be like every session, we're going to be spending time on that. People are asking why. Like, why am I feeling this way? Why do I have these patterns? Why am I here? Why has my life looked this way? Why am I thinking these things? So there's a lot of like looking back and there's a lot of storytelling, like going back and thinking about like what happened and all these other influences. And that's great. And I also think that is where like the training that therapists get kind of like hits a wall because there's not a lot that happens beyond that. And one of the things I didn't like as a therapist is both when I was a client and I had clients of my own, I just noticed that people sometimes like every session is just like talking about the same thing over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And it's not that that's bad. I think it's great to have like more context and more understanding. Like that can provide you a lot of insight. But what I love about coaching is that it's just asking different questions. And the questions are like, what do you want to be different? And how are we going to implement that? So it's very like forward focused. It's very change focused. It's very action focused.
Yeah.
And they're good complements for each other. It also doesn't mean that there's never a therapy session where those same questions are being asked, or never a coaching session where we ask why. And we are kind of like looking at some past events, or like just trying to pick up some clues or some context.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not spending every session there. The sessions are very much going to be focused on like, okay, the thing that you're wanting to change, like, how did it go this week? What are the obstacles? What are you struggling with? Like, what do we need to tweak? How is it going?
Yeah. I think that that's like a big key component. It sounds like hard because for women, we're like, why? We're big why, or at least I'm a big why person. But then my husband is like, okay, give me the actionable steps.
Yeah.
But like in reality, I want those actionable steps.
Yeah. I
Maybe.
think there's sometimes a thought that clients and therapists are kind of unaware of, that they are attaching to. And the thought is, if I know why, this won't be such a problem anymore. Like, if I could explain it, if I knew why I was doing this or why this was happening, then it'll be like somehow like I understand it now and I just don't. It's like
Oh,
not a
thank
problem.
God.
Yeah, it's like not a problem anymore. But the fact is, you'll never fully understand why.
Yeah.
You can make a lot of good guesses. You can be like fairly certain. And it never, like, knowing all of that, it doesn't make it any less of a problem. You still have to learn how to change those default responses and settings.
Yeah.
So I think it does, like I said, it gives you context, it gives you understanding, it gives you insight, but it's not going to just like make it not a problem anymore.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to shift gears
Mhm.
because in your little intro, I talked about how you were a spicy
Yeah.
neurodivergent. So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
And then let's talk about how it's, again, like you said, like therapists maybe don't go to that level when they're talking about themselves online or like their practice,
Mhm.
but you do. And so
Yeah.
I want to talk about that. Like, how does it?
I think it is more common, like I said. Like, I think things are changing and more therapists. Like Tiffany Rowe is a great example. She's on
Mhm.
Instagram. She talks a lot about her personal life and what she thinks, and I'm all for that. For me, I just think, like, whether it's a therapist or a coach, research says, and I think this is research on therapy, but I think it applies for coaching as well. The research says that the most important factor in whether or not you feel like the work that you've done with a practitioner is successful is your rapport with them. It's not their modality, it's not the trainings that they've had, right? It's not their area of expertise necessarily, it's the rapport. So the relationship that you have, if you feel like they're a good fit for you. And like, great example is living in the South, things are a little more conservative leaning. And so, like, I had a friend who was going to a couples therapist working on their relationship, her and her husband. And so this therapist is like, kind of guiding. There's no way for a therapist to be completely unbiased.
Right.
Like, we all have opinions, we all have thoughts. So this therapist was working with them. And then after like a few months, she happened to see, like, I think on Facebook, a friend of a friend, who they were somehow connected. And she saw something about her therapist and who this therapist had voted for and her political leanings. And it like ruined it for her.
Yeah,
Because she was like, wait. I already felt like this wasn't working, but now I'm like assuming that you have certain ideas about gender roles and
Mhm.
about like how the relationship should be and traditional relationships and, how men are and how women are. And that's who she had been working with.
Well, and it does. I don't necessarily want to go in and ask, like, if I'm going to go to therapy, I'm not going to go in and ask, like, tell me all of your religious views, tell me all
Yeah.
of these things. But on some level, like,
Yeah.
I need to be able to
You
know
want to
that,
know that they align with you.
yeah, or that we're not talking to somebody who is going to give us the complete opposite than what we already believe and feel.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So,
Yeah.
like, see, can see both sides of it. I can see not wanting to put that out there, but then I can see like maybe I will connect with the people who need to connect with me because I put this out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's, when I talk about being neurodivergent, that was just another aspect of myself, and it has informed a lot of my work and how I like make plans with clients. And I tend to get a lot of clients who are neurodivergent, even though I'm the coach for neurodivergent people. It's not really my niche, but I have a brain that is similar to theirs. So I know what they're talking about. I know what they're going through. I know what their experience is. I know how they might struggle in some areas and how we might need to tweak things that we're doing to accommodate for their brain. I only got diagnosed maybe 4 years ago after my kids. Their dad was, he was given orders for Sicily. And so went over there during COVID. And because my kids were doing like school in their bedroom, we were like, why don't you go? Like, you have more time with your dad. You'd be over there. Of course, we didn't know how long COVID was going to last.
Yeah, I know.
We were thinking like, oh, you could go travel some.
Yeah.
So they went over there for 2 years. And after they left, all the things that I was kind of attributing to mom brain, because I was like so overwhelmed with kids, they were still happening. Like, why am I so hungry? Oh, I went to heat up something in the microwave 4 hours ago.
And forgot.
And it's still there. Yeah. Where's my favorite coffee mug? Oh, it's still there from yesterday when I was reheating it,
Yeah.
Just as an example. Like, there were things that I started noticing, and then social media, I started seeing stuff online about ADHD, and I was like, oh my God, this kind of fits. And so I went and got myself assessed.
Yeah. I think there's also, like, to be completely transparent, I was diagnosed at 13. But I'm having a hard time going as an adult. I stopped taking medication when I was 15. I was a rebellious teenager who felt like I don't need this. So
but
I
nobody
did
was telling you about, probably they weren't educating you about ADHD in general. They were just like, you have this thing, here's some medicine.
Yeah. And it was so new that like, I didn't know to ask for a different medication. My mom didn't know how to ask for a different even though she was in the mental health world, it was still so new and like fresh that she didn't know.
And how we understand it in women has
it's
totally changed since then.
Well, so skip forward to now as a 30-year-old woman who is like, okay, maybe there would be some benefit for me looking at getting back on medication and what that is. Because I have also expressed anxiety, they're like, I've talked to 3 medical professionals who are hesitant to even prescribe me ADHD medication. They'll give me anxiety medicine at the drop of a hat, but they won't give me ADHD medication.
It's because it's a controlled substance.
Until I go back and get a full psychological evaluation.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like,
oh, because there's no records?
There's no records from when I was 13. And they're like,
okay,
you've gone through all these things, you're changing, blah, blah, blah.
For everyone listening, those are very expensive, a full psychological evaluation. And a lot of times your insurance does not pay for it because they're like, you're an adult. Like, why do you? It's usually like kids. They'll pay for kids. So I have had success with my daughter, doing this for my daughter and with clients using ADHD online. It's like $180. You pay out of pocket. You fill out a very thorough questionnaire. I was kind of surprised at how thorough it was, actually. And then that's like the first phase. If you meet enough criteria from the questionnaire, which is assessed by a licensed clinician who is able to diagnose, then they will schedule a follow-up with you. It may be just a phone call. It may be video. They might ask you more questions. And then you get a full assessment that you can take to your primary care provider and say, like, here, I have this diagnosis.
That's amazing.
And they can also prescribe you medication. It's just a little more expensive, because you have to check in like every 3 months and you're paying out of pocket.
Yeah.
But it needs to be more accessible.
Well, and like, I think because I've heard this a lot too, it's like, I think people were over-diagnosing at this point, or people are just over-diagnosing it. And it's like,
if you meet criteria, you meet criteria.
Yeah, that may be true, but also maybe we weren't. Maybe it wasn't even getting diagnosed.
Yes.
As it needed to get. Like, obviously.
Yes. Well, here's the thing, like it's a controlled substance, stimulant medications, because it is basically like meth. It's very similar to meth when you look at the like chemical compound. But in someone who does not have diagnosable ADHD, the way that it interacts in the brain, it will create, it's very likely they get addicted, right?
Yeah.
Because of the way that it works.
Well-
People who have a diagnosis of ADHD, they do not get addicted.
No, and that's the thing that sucks is like there are so many like, you know, even when I was in college, kids that were just using it
Yeah.
to do
Yeah.
study.
But you can almost like prescribe and get diagnostic information because you can see how it is working or it's not. So if someone gets a diagnosis and someone else is like, I don't know if you really have it, maybe it's just overdiagnosed, put them on a stimulant, you will know whether or not they meet the criteria because the way that that stimulant affects them and the change that you'll see in symptoms is going to be so different than in someone who does not meet diagnostic criteria.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, but.
And also to the anxiety piece, like there's a high co-occurrence of anxiety and depression and even something like OCD in people who have some sort of neurodivergence. So there's a high co-occurrence of someone with ADHD having anxiety. And sometimes it's misdiagnosed. And in women, because one of the things that ADHD affects is your executive functioning skills, one of those is emotional regulation. And so there's a lot of women who have been diagnosed with a rapid cycling mood disorder. You know, people will joke about like, oh, it's so bipolar because you're up and down.
Mhm.
And it is ADHD. It's not anxiety. It's not a mood disorder. It's your ability to regulate your emotions. I could really get going on this. I get frustrated.
I mean, I
about
could
it.
talk about this for forever, but we don't have forever to talk about it.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe
Oof.
therapist call at some point. We're talking about our anxiety and our ADHD.
Yeah. Well,
It makes a feature in every conversation.
and also perimenopause. Sometimes women can start exhibiting ADHD symptoms because your neurotransmitters and your hormones affect your neurotransmitters. And so when everything gets a little crazy in perimenopause, which can also last 4 to 10 years, FYI, yeah, you can have symptoms of ADHD. And I don't care if it's ADHD or if it's hormones or whatever, like go to a clinician, talk to them about what's going on. If you meet criteria for something, you meet criteria for something.
I just love women talking more about it in general. Never before.
I'm in the middle of it.
About it,
Yeah.
and I love it. I mean, like I say this all the time, that you see the raised rates of women and alcohol and ER visits and substance abuse, and it's because there's not enough conversations about how you're feeling different because you're actually feeling different. So
I do want to give a shout out. There's another coach that I know. She lives in the UK and her name is Maisie Hill. And she has a great podcast that used to be called Period Power, I think. She's written 2 books, but the second one is Perimenopause Power. And it is a phenomenal book. It's just like a reference. I mean, it's huge, goes into lots of detail about the different things that you might experience during perimenopause and what you can do about them. So I want to throw that out there for anyone who might need it because it's a great, great book.
And like, you know, I love this.
It on me and then just said, bye, go home. And I was like, I don't know what any of that means.
Lost her again. We got to figure that internet out. Child, like, I don't know what's happening with your internet, but we're going to figure out your internet, I promise, for the next.
Oh, that
sucks. Okay, well, on that glitchy, lovely end note, thank you, Kimberly, so much for being on here with us. And what is the name of your podcast so people can tune in?
Yeah, it's called Decisions Change Everything. And it is on Spotify and Apple Podcast. And then you can also find me on socials at the Kimberly Mathis.
Yes, and we will link everything in our show notes or in the notes below. So yeah, be sure to check her out. You don't have to be in Tennessee even to like go see her.
I know, that's another wonderful thing about coaching is you can move anywhere and keep your same person you're working with if you want to.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. I mean, especially if you find, your neurodivergent equal over there. You don't have to lose her if
So
you change.
anytime you want some rants over mental health stuff, just have me back on. I can get on a soapbox.
We will. We'll even give you like your own little box to stand on. How about that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that'll work.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's been
All
great.
right.